AskReddit by Faraj Eltara. What is a part of history that we consider to be a fact is 100% fake? The image of Roman gladiators fighting to the death. While there were many exhibition fights in the arenas where the goal was death, these were not gladiator contests. Prisoners, and the condemned, were thrown out to fight to the death, but not real gladiators. Training a gladiator was an expensive and lengthy investment, and having them die constantly would be bad for business. If a gladiator ended up dying in the arena, the guy who sponsored the games would have to reimburse the gladiator school. It was really more like choreographed combat than anything. Gladiators practiced spectacular but useless moves to make the crowd gasp. There's a very thorough and interesting display in the Roman amphitheater in Nimes, France that dispels a lot of these myths. That the Spanish Armada was destroyed. They did lose 44 ships, out of 137. And the British also didn't beat them off with a small force. Their navy was actually significantly larger, with 197 ships, since they were joined by the Dutch Republic. A decisive defeat? Yes. A small English force overcoming and obliterating the might of the entire Spanish and Portuguese navy? No. Wasn't a good chunk of the Armada destroyed by storms before they made land? William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. I also find it weird, hilarious, sad that that's what he's known for, instead of being known for being the only person to have served as both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Ned Kelly's last words being "such is life." That was made up by the reporter. So many Aussies have it tattooed or have big stickers on their 4x4s. But I guess "oh well" doesn't have the same ring to it. I like "oh well" lol. Paul Revere did not run around Massachusetts shouting "the British are coming," because if he did, everyone would look at him like he'd lost his mind. Almost everyone in the colonies was British. He actually said, "the regulars are coming." The lore I was taught growing up was that the redcoats are coming. The lady who sued McDonald's didn't do so frivolously. She received third-degree burns from how hot that coffee was, and needed a skin graft. It was quickly found that that location was keeping the coffee well above the temperature you can legally serve a hot drink in a cup at. The fact that most people think this suit was over the temperature of the coffee, and not the debilitating burns that woman received, is one of the PR world's greatest triumphs. You are not immune to propaganda. It was actually found that McDonald's had all of their locations keeping coffee temps too hot. Multiple reports of burns were placed before the main incident and were just settled out of court and ignored by the corporation. The poor woman just wanted enough money to cover her medical bills and nothing more originally. That Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Albert Einstein. General public not being aware that classical Greece and Rome had colored paints all over those statues, much less colored dyes in their clothes. Edit. Point being, we tend to believe that there was a lot of white in the classical period, which isn't actually the case. Related to Rome, gladiators used to advertise for local blacksmiths who provided them armor and weapons. Ridley Scott intended to portray this in Gladiator, but left it out because he felt people wouldn't believe it. Ninjas dressed in all black to stay stealthy in the night or something like that. Ninjas dressed like normal people to blend in. The all black look stemmed from Japanese theater to make it more obvious to the audience who the ninjas were. If they wore all black, it'd be quite obvious and they'd stick out like a sore thumb. Edit. Most of you pointed out it also came from stagehands. That makes a lot of sense too. Of course they didn't wear all black. There were red, white, blue and later even green ninjas. Einstein never failed math. The rumor started from Ripley's Believe It or Not, and Einstein actually responded to them saying, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus." He wasn't very good at the non-science related classes though and did fail French. I'm so confused about Einstein and Ripley's believe it or not existing at the same time. So many people completely misunderstand pre-industrial lifespans. The average age of death was 30 not because our bodies wore out faster, but because of how averages are calculated. A lot of people died as children. A much larger chunk of the population died in wars. If you got in an accident, healing without modern medicine was difficult. But for people who reached adulthood, and then avoided violence, injury, and plague, living to be 60 or 70 was pretty normal. It's the difference between average lifespan and life expectancy. Almost everything about the medieval times. Our image of it is highly influenced by Hollywood. Plug for the podcast We're Not So Different with deep dives on nearly every aspect of medieval society by Eleanor Janiger, PhD who specializes in the period. Fascinating stuff. That people use swords and axes all the time. Spears? It's spears. Most of human history has been spears. Vikings used spears. Samurai and knights used spears. Hell, bayonets exist because people felt you always need a spear, even with a rifle in your hand. William Blake said, when the stars threw down their spears, and watered heaven with their tears. Which is stupid. No one throws down their spear. Spears are great for poking people to death. Combat is all about hitting a person without being hit yourself. It's why we have been developing stuff to hit each other from further and further away. Marie Antoinette saying let them eat cake. Although as I recall weren't her last words actually an apology to her executioner for tripping over his foot. Romans indulged in food so much they had a special place to go and vomit so they could eat more. Maybe that has been dispelled by now but many still believe it. I've read Emperor Vitellius did actually do this, but as an exception rather than the rule. However, from what I remember the source for this was one of the dozen or so Roman historians who liked to make shit up for dramatic effect, so even if I'm not misremembering, there's still a good chance it's BS. This is a little niche, but it's been a long-held belief in the gaming community that one of Nintendo's business ventures before getting into the video game market was love hotels, hourly hotels whose main purpose is to knock boots in. This has been repeated as fact alongside their other historical ventures like playing cards, taxes, instant food, and toys. But last year a Nintendo enthusiast did a dive into their historical financial records and found no definitive proof that they ever ran or were associated with love hotels in any way. I've always heard they started out as a playing card company. I had never heard of the others. Interesting. A Stegosaurus fighting a T-Rex. They live millions of years apart. Stegosaurus 144 lived million years ago, T-Rex 65 million years ago. Insane difference. Still almost most every dinosaur related media places them together. There's a kids show called Dinosaur Train that does a good job showing the different periods that the dinosaurs lived in. The train is literally a time machine and they go through tunnels to get from one period to another. Lol, I thought it was neat that they cared enough to educate kids about how not all dinosaurs lived among each other. Whatever the fuck is on the History Channel nowadays. I know the exact moment I gave up on the History Channel. A guy came into a pawn shop with a uniform and said, "It's from the war with the Philippines." The guy in the shop said, "There's no such thing as the war with the Philippines." My undergrad senior thesis was on the Philippine-American War. Rabbits cannot live on a diet of carrots and fruits. It's like asking a toddler to live on a diet of candy. They also cannot live on a diet of completely lettuce and leaves, though it's close. Rabbits need hay for a healthy diet, and pellets are heavily recommended as well, though they also have limits. Should be in the bag according to the bunny's weight. Greens are good, not to be the main diet, and fruits or carrots can be given as treats. Bugs Bunny led a lot of people to believe rabbits live off of carrots. They do not. They will die if you expect them to live on a diet of 100% carrots. Lemmings just run off a cliff to their deaths every year. Thanks for that one, Disney. I watched the video of how Disney got us all to believe this. Can't remember where I saw it, but I wish I could remember. And I'm surprised more anti-Disney groups don't bring it up. That Hitler was a raging, shouting maniac in person. I think we want to believe that he would be that way because the idea that someone who was polite and low-key could be so evil is really disturbing. According to his personal secretary and many people who knew him, Hitler rarely showed anger and was subdued but friendly in private. Trojan was there during the incident that inspired the scene in the movie Downfall that became a meme, and she said that she was completely shocked to hear Hitler raise his voice. She had worked for him for over 2 years. I think that's mainly due to his speeches and the clips of him clearly on amphetamines. Under God was not in the original version of the Pledge of Allegiance. https://www.ashisstory.org/documents/pledge.htm. The pledge was written in 1892. It wasn't until 1954 that President Eisenhower added under God in response to fear of communism during WW2. Also, when first implemented, during the pledge people raised their right arm forward so the hand was level with their eyes, directed at the flag. However, this was changed during WW2 because it resembled the Nazi salute. The procedure was changed to place the right hand over the heart. In Christmas Vacation, when Aunt Bethany says grace and starts reciting the pledge instead, she leaves out under God at the end while the others all say it. She and Uncle Louie are the oldest people there, so it kinda makes sense. There is a joke saying that Austria's greatest success is making everyone believe that Mozart was Austrian and Hitler was German. Wasn't Mozart from Salzburg? The Irish famine wasn't just a natural disaster. There was plenty of food in Ireland, it was just exported to Britain. Edit, clarity. Our staple food for most people was the potato, so the failure of the crop was devastating. However, yes, there was so much food being grown here that was exported. We were also as a people given the option to have food if we denounced our religion, leading to the phrase taking the soup. To take the soup was to denounce Catholicism and become Protestant. Edit spelling. That the Library of Alexandria being burned down set humanity back hundreds or even thousands of years. At the time that it was finally destroyed in 1948 BC, most of its collection had already been copied and distributed to other libraries and universities, or the important scrolls were relocated. It was no longer an important meeting place for great scholars either, and it's not entirely clear how much of it was even destroyed during the fire, as many believe that it was even partially rebuilt afterwards. It ultimately just fell out of relevance throughout the years and didn't really take any of the information stored within with it. I believe within reason that the end of Islamic Golden Age is much more impactful than the burning of the Library of Alexandria. An entire culture just ceasing to advance STEM is much more devastating. Bill Clinton did in fact have sex with that woman. Are you talking about sex or sexual relations? That Hitler had one testicle and Napoleon was short. Also that Himmler had two and that they were small. That George Washington had wooden teeth. He had false teeth, yes. But they were made of ivory. He never had wooden teeth. I heard that Methuselah had like 30 goddamn dicks. Not sure if quite at the level you're asking for, but it seems to be common knowledge that people didn't fight back against Germans in WW2, and it's because they didn't have guns or were cowards. They fought back a lot. The largest was likely https://en.m.wikipedia.org/wiki/Warsaw_uprising. It just turns out that normal people fighting against a military tend to do poorly. The Poles in general did a rather good job fighting the Nazis, but when they had to start fighting Nazis and Soviets at the same time, it became impossible. That Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII, was a promiscuous adulterer who had many affairs while married to the king. In reality, she was a child who was groomed and or sexually assaulted by no less than 4 men, including the king, whom she was supposed to be able to trust, and the king murdered her for it. The same goes for Anne Boleyn, his second wife. She never committed adultery, incest, or witchcraft, but was murdered because the king's cronies didn't like how much influence she had over him, so they turned him against her. He also used the fact that she couldn't bear him a son as further ammo. That the Indians and the Pilgrims sat down at a big table at Thanksgiving and shared a big happy meal. I don't see how anyone could believe this. McDonald's wasn't even a thing back then. That when Europeans first arrived on the east coast of what is now the US, the land was very sparsely populated and so there was a lot of free land to settle, at least that's what I've been taught in school. In reality it turns out the coast was densely populated with native settlements, to the point where Europeans couldn't even disembark because the natives wouldn't allow them. They would keep them at the bay just to trade and then force them to turn back. It wasn't until European diseases spread through the continent that 95% of the indigenous population died, and that's when the first colonies began in the US, so that's why we now have the misconception of there always having been lots of open land. In general there are tons of misconceptions about Native Americans and colonial history. I recommend the book 1491 by Charles C. Mann, which clears up a lot of these misconceptions. It's where I got the above information from as well. I also don't think people really understand how bad the American plagues were, especially when considered next to how severe they were in a historical context. As far as I can tell they don't even have a well agreed upon formal name. Vikings wore horned helmets. They didn't, sorry. The horned helmets originated in Wagner's Ring Cycle Ike. No historical evidence for the Vikings wearing them, although they did have big scary carvings on the prows of their boats. Not fake, but the Boston Massacre was not evil redcoats shooting peaceful American protesters. That protest was anything but peaceful. It was basically a riot. They were throwing rocks and other objects at the redcoats, trying to goad them into something. The soldiers probably had orders not to shoot, but they were outnumbered and scared, so finally they fired. They were arrested and tried. John Adams, the future second president, defended them in court and won. Ice balls. They threw a lot of ice balls. The Boston Massacre and Tea Party were both Boston being Boston and drunk. That War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy was initially titled War, What Is It Good For? You told Testica that Tolstoy wanted to name his book War, What Is It Good For? For most historical things, that's just how people were then. Columbus was known and criticized for being excessively cruel. There have been slavery abolitionists in every era, etc., etc. Columbus was jailed for his cruelty and mismanagement of Hispaniola. As a Texan there is so much Alamo that's straight BS. Yeah, I heard there was a basement there. Turns out, no basement. Many believe that Che Guevara was Cuban while he was Argentinian. Bit of an itch here, but growing up as an evangelical Christian I heard more times than I can remember that Darwin rejected the theory of evolution and embraced Christianity on his deathbed. 100% never happened. I haven't seen this on here yet, but no one in the town of Salem was actually burnt at the stake during the witch trials. Most of them were hung, muhaha, with one being crushed under rocks. But with most of the kids in school now reading The Crucible, I think this'll start being more well known. Edit, GRAR for those who really, really care. Edit 2, I'm not very informed, so I'm not surprised that people have been reading The Crucible long before my school or the school before it has. It was written in 1958, after all. Edit 3, hung, hanged, etc. The only crime here is me getting more upvotes than the question. It's nuts 15 years later, witch trials were completely abandoned. That extreme of a policy changed so quickly in the 1700s. Catherine the Great never had sex with horses. Those were rumors started by her enemies. How Spartans suited up for battle and fought against Xerxes. Contrary to what the movie 300 showed. They wore heavy bronze armor, not battle thongs and boots. Shields had a red lambda painted on them. Only high-level officers had red plumes on them. Shit's expensive, guys, not everyone can have them. At Thermopylae, the movie shows only 300 Spartans. There were actually about 1200 allies that helped and rotated in and out of battle. The battle was to stall the Persian advance to build up forces at Salamis. They rarely ever broke formation, like never. They maintained the phalanx discipline. In the movie you see them breaking formation a lot, especially in that slow-mo scene where Leonidas kills like 10 in a row. They were not ripped dudes. More disciplined and athletic, but not every single one was jacked. Edit. Bronze armor, not brass armor. Deleted. The Trojan horse wasn't real. Historians are all pretty much unanimous on this. My personal theory is that the Trojan horse story relates to a traitor within Troy's cavalry. Most anything to do with pilgrims, in America at least. That the Spanish flu is Spanish in origin. One from America would be that the famous Johnny Appleseed, out of the goodness of his heart, walked across much of the USA, and even a bit into Canada, planting apple orchards to provide the locals with healthy apples. In reality, he was an eccentric who had financial means and was a shrewd businessman. Yes, he did, in fact, walk around barefoot with a cooking pot on his head, that much is true. Johnny Appleseed, known as John Chapman to his mother, was planting orchards in areas he believed people would soon move as westward expansion grew across the Midwest and us. But the apples he planted were crap. They were used to make cider and only to make cider. They were sour and not edible. People eventually moved to those lands, as he predicted, and he paid them to look after his orchards and harvest the apples he sold to breweries.